Good evening, this is Pastor Sadell Bradley. I'm out here repping Mortar today, so shout out to all my Mortar family. We're here for Bible study at the Warehouse Church. We're so glad you have joined us tonight. We're going to be talking about making trouble today out of Acts 22. We're in a series about Acts. We're talking about the ways in which the early church acted up, did things that were revolutionary, were so different from the norm. And today we're talking about making trouble. Some of you might have heard of John Lewis, the congressman who recently passed away, talking about the work of social justice being good trouble. But at the time when he was with Dr. King and his contemporaries, everybody didn't think that trouble was good. They thought that they were troublemakers. A troublemaker is a person who habitually causes difficulty or problems, especially by inciting others to defy those in authority. So in the same way as the civil rights movement at the time was making trouble, good trouble, Paul and his contemporaries in the New Testament church were making trouble. Turn into your Bibles at Acts 22. I'll start at verse 1. 5 days after Ananias, the high priest, arrived with some of the Jewish elders and the lawyer Tertullus to present their case against Paul to the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented the charges against Paul in the following address to the governor. You have provided a long period of peace for us Jews and with foresight have enacted reforms for us. For all of this, Your Excellency, we are grateful to you. But I don't want to bore you, so please give me your attention for only a moment. We have found this man, talking about Paul, to be a troublemaker who is constantly stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the cult known as the Nazarenes. Furthermore, he was trying to desecrate the temple when we arrested him. You can find out the truth of our accusations by examining him yourself. Then the other Jews chimed in, declaring that everything Tertullus said was true. So here, as we talked about with Pastor Sherman yesterday, they were accusing Paul of making riots, accusing Paul everywhere he went of causing people to revolt against Judaism, and now they're calling him a ringleader of the cult known as the Nazarenes, for Jesus of Nazareth, these followers of this Messiah, so-called, they said. And Paul was a troublemaker. He's constantly, they said, stirring up riots of the Jews all over the world. Now, he's making this accusation to the governor. The governor's name is Felix. And he's calling, maybe in your New King James Version or your NIV version, he's calling Paul this word called loimos, Loimos. It's a Greek word that means he is a pestilent fellow. He is a pestilence, a public menace. This is where we get the word, the shortened version, a pest. He is a dangerous nuisance. Now, when you think about pestilence in the Bible, it talks about in Psalm 91 that God will deliver us from the noisome pestilence. Pestilence is destructive to life. It is deadly. It causes great annoyance. It is troublesome. It is harmful or dangerous. Pestilence is like a plague. But in this case, he's saying that the pestilence Paul is dangerous to public order. To the morality that the Jews had, the religious systems that they were following. This word pernicious, meaning it's having a harmful effect, especially in a gradual or subtle way. A plague. Now, we understand what a plague is because we just got out of one, COVID-19. It's a contagious disease that spreads rapidly and kills many people, something that causes trouble or irritation. Now, COVID-19, you couldn't see the virus. You couldn't detect where it was. You couldn't run from it. It was a plague. And so we understand the power of something that goes viral. It's unseen and affects everything in its wake, everything it touches. And here was the gospel going forth through Paul and his contemporaries, and it was beginning to change everything that it touched. And so these Jewish leaders were afraid that it was going to spread, and they wanted to make sure that they would stop the spread. When we think about the pandemic COVID-19, it impacted us in more ways than just physical illness or even physical death. The pandemic impacted our mental health and emotions. We had fear and anxiety unlike never before. It caused us to be depressed. Socially, we were changed. We had isolation in ways that we never had before. For many of us, it impacted our financial lives, our security. Some people got more because of the governmental aid, and some people were struggling because they couldn't work. When something spreads virally into a culture and things begin to change, it changes not just one category. Even the COVID-19 has probably impacted us in more ways than we probably understand. And so here they're beginning to see this really small, what they call a cult of the Nazarenes, these people coming out of Nazareth believing that Jesus was Messiah, this way, following the way of Jesus, a small cult, but the influence of it was growing and going viral. These leaders wanted to stop it. They wanted to stop Paul. Really, what they wanted to stop was the message that Jesus Christ was the way, the truth, and the life, that Jesus Christ was the Jews' long-awaited Messiah. And they wanted to stop the spread of this message so badly that they were willing to falsely accuse, imprison, and kill Paul and anyone else who was preaching this way and living this way. And they wanted to not just shut them up, they wanted to take them out so that no message about Jesus would take hold and extinguish the power of their religious system and their beliefs and everything that it provided for them, the status, the power, the buildings, all of that. And Paul was like, wait a minute, you're accusing me of something. One, you weren't even there. It happened with Jews that were from the Asia area, but Paul stood up to refute them in verse 10. And Paul told the governor, as the governor motioned for Paul to speak, he said, I know, sir, that you have been a judge of Jewish affairs for many years. So I gladly present my defense before you. You can quickly discover that I arrived in Jerusalem no more than 12 days ago to worship at the temple. So he's like, I'm not coming here to cause trouble. I came to worship at the temple. Verse 12 says, my accusers never found me arguing with anyone in the temple, nor stirring up a riot in any synagogue or on the streets of the city. These men cannot prove the things they accuse me of doing. But I admit that I follow the way, which they call a cult. So he said, I am identifying myself with Jesus. And we talked about before how when Jesus told his disciples, they will throw you out of the synagogues. They will hate you. They will imprison you. They will kill you on account of your identification with me. And Paul said, I admit I wasn't doing anything that you are telling me that they are accusing me of, but I am a follower of the way. I worship the God of our ancestors. And I firmly believe the Jewish law and everything written in the prophets. So Jesus came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. So Paul is saying, I believe everything of the God of our ancestors. I just believe that this Jesus, who you crucified, is Lord and Christ. He is our long-awaited Messiah. Verse 15 says, I have the same hope in God that these men have, that he will raise both the righteous and the unrighteous. Because of this, I always try to maintain a clear conscience before God and all people. So Paul's saying, I believe that Jesus is the Messiah. I believe he is the long-awaited one. I believe that God, Yahweh, is his Father. I believe he is the one who has come to save us. And I believe in the resurrection. I believe it's going to happen to the righteous. I believe it's going to happen to the unrighteous. And because of this, I'll watch the way that I live. I always try, the King James says, to exercise myself, to have a conscience void of offense toward God and toward man. Now, our conscience is an inner feeling, the voice that acts as a guide to us on the rightness or the wrongness of our behavior. Paul's saying this Greek word, aproskopos, A-P-R-O-S-K-O-P-O-S. It means not causing to stumble, free from hurt or harm, not offending, not causing offense, being blameless. And Paul's saying, I've got this hope of the resurrection in my view. I'm looking to be raised with Christ, and I'm looking to have heaven as my home. And so I conduct myself in a certain way. I'm not going to let anything that God does cause me to stumble, and I'm not going to let anything that people do cause me to stumble, and I'm not going to put a stumbling block in anyone's way. This is a powerful thing that Paul said. Despite the fact that they're blaming me, beating me, accusing me, imprisoning me, doing all of these things, I have worked, I am exercising myself to not be offended by what they are doing and have done. I'm also exercising myself to not be offended at God for allowing these things to be done, because he's doing that for his glory's sake. I don't know all of his ways, but I am following him. And thirdly, I am not going to be a person who is offending and putting a stumbling block in other people's way. I am going to live a blameless life. Verse 17, he says, after several years away, I returned to Jerusalem with money to aid my people and to offer sacrifices to God. My accusers saw me in the temple as I was completing a purification ceremony. There was no crowd around me and no rioting, but some Jews from the province of Asia, which is now Turkey, were there, and they ought to be here to bring charges if they have anything against me. So these Jewish people that are coming to you, Governor, are not even the people I was around when these so-called events occurred. Verse 20 says, ask these men here what crime the Jewish High Council found me guilty of, except for the one time I shouted, I am on trial before you today because I believe in the resurrection of the dead. And probably we've talked throughout this series that the Sanhedrin was a court that was comprised both of Sadducees and Pharisees who were members of the elite class. The Sadducees rejected any belief in the resurrection of the dead, but the Pharisees believed in the resurrection. And Paul was a Pharisee. He talked about this in Philippians. I was a Pharisee who was trained under Gamaliel. And the Sadducees denied any afterlife, and they held that the soul perished at the time of death. But the Pharisees, which Paul was a part of, believed in the afterlife and in an appropriate reward for those who did well and punishment for individuals who defied God. So now the Sadducees are here, and they're both a part of these the Sanhedrin council. The Sadducees rejected the idea of the unseen spiritual world, but the Pharisees taught in the existence of angels and demons and the spiritual realm and in heaven and Sheol and Hades and hell. They talked about all of these things. So we saw last chapter that Paul was shrewdly using these theological differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees in order to escape the clutches of the Sanhedrin. And Paul was arrested in Jerusalem, and he made his defense before the Sanhedrin, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and some of them were Pharisees. And Paul called out, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. We talked about that last week in Acts 23:6. So Paul's mention of the resurrection precipitated a dispute between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided, and it caused a great uproar, not because he was doing anything to excite it, but that they were already at odds. And that Roman commander that was there, who was watching all the proceedings go forth, sent in a troop to rescue Paul from the violence that was occurring, and then he was brought to a man, the governor, whose name was Antonius Felix, or Felix. Now, Antonius Felix was formerly a slave, but was promoted by Claudius Caesar to the office of governor. And so now Paul is standing before Felix. And in verse 22, it says, at that point, Felix, who was quite familiar with the way, adjourned the hearing and said, wait until Lysias, the garrison commander, arrives. Then I will decide the case. Felix ordered an officer to keep Paul in custody, but to keep him some freedom, to give him some freedom and allow his friends to visit and take care of his needs. A few days later, Felix came back with his wife, whose name was Drusilla, and Drusilla was a Jewish woman. Sending for Paul, Felix and Drusilla listened as he told them about faith in Christ Jesus. So Felix's wife was a Jewish person. Drusilla and Felix sat under Paul's teaching and learned about Jesus Christ. Isn't that amazing? How all this beating and imprisoning and rioting and all of these moving from place to place and going under all these tribunals allowed Paul to bring the gospel to Felix and his wife. And 25 says, as he reasoned with them about righteousness and self-control and the coming day of judgment, Felix, the governor, became frightened. Go away for now, he replied. When it is more convenient, I'll call for you again. Now, there may be a few reasons why Felix was frightened. The Roman historian Tacitus describes Felix as a cruel, licentious, and base leader. That means he was a despot. He was a really mean guy. And the history is that while in Judea, while he was around the Jewish people, Felix became attracted to Drusilla. And Drusilla was a daughter of Herod Agrippa I, which is a king of the Jewish people. And so Felix enticed Drusilla away from her husband, whose name was Azizus. And then they later married each other. So kind of like the way that David was looking over the fence and he saw Bathsheba and he had Uriah killed, her husband was killed. You know, the Bible has a lot of scandal. It's really interesting. There's a lot of things that go on. If you want to read it, it's better than some of the reality TV we watch. But anyway, Felix started to listen to Paul talk about Jesus Christ and self-control and righteousness. And it says Felix became frightened. Maybe it was because of how cruelly he had treated the people. Maybe it was because of the fact that he took a man's wife away from him and married her. Anyway, it seems that Felix, unlike Paul, had a guilty conscience, whereas Paul had a clear conscience before God and with other people. So Felix, knowing that he was a scoundrel, was looking for Paul to be one too, but Paul acted up, turning the flip on him by having godly character. Paul was concerned with right living, right character, living good before God. But in verse 26, it says that Felix also hoped that Paul would bribe him. So he sent for him quite often and talked with him. So after time, he's thinking, okay, if this guy's in prison long enough, he's going to offer me a bribe to get out. He's going to do something corrupt, and I'm going to give him a favor, and that's going to prove that he's not really the holy man that he says he is. Verse 27 says that after 2 years went by in this way, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus. So for 2 years, he learned about the way of Christ. He tried to see whether he could tempt Paul to bribe him, and it never happened. And then he was succeeded by another leader. And because Felix wanted to gain favor with the Jewish people, he left Paul in prison. Now, some scholars surmise that another reason Felix might have left Paul in jail could be that he was reluctant to pronounce judgment on a man who was clearly innocent. This reminds me of the story of Jesus and his crucifixion, when Pontius Pilate was trying to release him and give the crowd Barabbas, who was a known criminal. And they were like, no, we want to release Barabbas and crucify Jesus. And Pontius Pilate was like, this man has done nothing wrong. And even his wife was concerned about him trying Jesus because Jesus was an innocent man. And he told the crowd, hey, the blood is on your hands because I know that Jesus is innocent. In the same way, Felix probably had some sense of conscience because Paul was clearly innocent. Or maybe he wanted to please his wife Drusilla. Verse 27 clearly says that Felix wanted to curry the favor, the political favor of the Jews by leaving Paul in prison. Historians record that upon the loss of his governorship, Felix was summoned to Rome, where certain of his former Jewish subjects accused him of cruelty and corruption. And that's what they say in the Bible, be sure your sin will find you out. Felix was found guilty, but was spared the death penalty. And some believe that Felix represents people who are intrigued by the gospel. Maybe they're in high position, maybe they're not. They're intrigued by the gospel of Jesus Christ. They hear the message. They know it has power. They might even know the good character of the people delivering the message, but they understand that surrendering to the way of Christ might mean loss of status, loss of power, loss of control over their own lives or even the lives of others. So many people hear the gospel, know that the messenger is living a clean life, but have to decide whether or not they're going to relinquish all to follow Jesus. Jesus said in John 14:6, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. Like Felix, many of you who might even be listening to me right now, know deep down inside that what I'm preaching today, what I'm teaching today about Jesus Christ being the Messiah, about there being a resurrection of the dead, about there being a heaven and a hell, about eternal judgment, that our bodies are going to separate from our spirits and we're going to be judged for all of the works that we did, whether they're good or evil, the things we've said, the things we've thought, the things that we've committed, the things that we have omitted. And only those who are identifying with Jesus Christ and under the blood of Jesus Christ, receiving the grace and mercy of God, are going to have an eternity in heaven with him. Are we like Felix and hearing it, but refusing to accept it? Or are we like so many billions of people around the world who heard the gospel message of Jesus Christ and said, I believe? I want to thank you for joining me today for Bible study. We thank you for joining us at the warehouse on Sunday. We're in our new location, 691 Fleming Road, in the annex of Fleming Road United Church of Christ. We'd love to have you come join with us at 10 a.m., 9 a.m. We have Bible study. We have children's ministry at 10. We would love to have you join us at the warehouse church where transformation begins.